Who are you?
It is me, David.
When Duke Henry Ashford opened his eyes after the accident, the first thing he asked was not whether he would walk again. It wasn't whether the estate had survived. It wasn't even whether he was going to die. He looked around the hospital room in confusion before asking the question that shattered his wife's heart. Where's Margaret? She had been sitting beside his hospital bed for 3 days without sleep. Her silver-threaded hair hastily pinned back. Her hands still carrying the faint smell of antiseptic and cold coffee. She had prayed through the longest night of her life while doctors warned her to prepare for the worst. Henry had survived against every expectation. He had opened his eyes. And he didn't recognize the woman who had spent 32 years loving him. Instead he asked for another woman. Margaret, Eleanor repeated quietly. Henry frowned. The girl from the village. The one I'm supposed to marry. Eleanor's fingers tightened around the blanket draped across her lap because Margaret wasn't his secretary or a distant relative. Margaret Collins had been Henry's first love. The woman he had planned to marry before duty. The woman he hadn't spoken about in decades. And according to the man lying in that hospital bed, it was still 1989. Henry looked toward Eleanor again. His expression softened. You seem kind, he said politely. Then he smiled. But I don't think we've met. Long nights waiting for Henry to return from business trips. She had stood beside him through scandals that threatened the Ashford name and buried both his parents with her hand clasped tightly around his. She had loved him when he had very little and remained beside him when he became one of the most respected men in the country. Never once had she imagined that the greatest grief of her life would arrive while the person she loved was still breathing. Mother. You don't have to do this. At the familiar lines around his eyes. At the hands she had held during the births of their. At the man who once danced with her barefoot in the kitchen after midnight because the electricity had gone out and they couldn't sleep. He looked exactly the same. And yet, he looked at her like a stranger. The following weeks became an exercise in quiet heartbreak. Henry remained convinced he was 30 years younger. He asked questions about people who had been dead for. He wondered why his father hadn't visited. He asked repeatedly whether Margaret knew about the accident. Each question cut Eleanor open in ways she couldn't explain. One morning she entered his room carrying breakfast. Henry glanced up from the newspaper. You really don't have to keep doing this. Doing what? You seem attached to me. The ordinary miracle of building a life together. She was merely attached. You don't owe me anything, Henry continued. But if you're waiting for me to remember you. I don't think I can. She turned toward the window before answering. You once told me that love isn't something people feel every day. What do you mean? You don't remember saying that. I thought so. Then quietly moved toward the door. Eleanor. How do you know my name? For several seconds, she couldn't trust herself to speak. Because once upon a time, you were the one who taught me never to forget it. Then she walked out of the room before he could see the tears she had spent weeks trying not to shed. And for the first time since waking up, Duke Henry Ashford found himself staring after a woman he couldn't remember. Yet somehow couldn't stop thinking about. Over the following weeks, Eleanor discovered that grief came in many forms. Sometimes it arrived quietly in the early hours of the morning, when she instinctively reached across the bed only to remember that Henry now occupied a hospital room where he thanked nurses politely and asked whether Margaret Collins had called. Did I have children? Henry asked one afternoon. Eleanor nearly dropped the book she had been reading aloud to him. You have 3. They're all grown now. I must have been a good father. You tried your best. Henry had never been a perfect man. He had missed school plays because of work, forgotten anniversaries, lost his temper during difficult seasons of life, and apologized awkwardly afterward. But he had also taught their son how to ride a bicycle, sat beside their daughters during thunderstorms, and spent countless evenings fixing broken toys at the kitchen table. He had loved them imperfectly, as most people did. The tragedy wasn't that Henry had become someone else. It was that the man Eleanor knew still existed somewhere inside him. And simply couldn't find his way home. One rainy afternoon, Eleanor arrived to find Henry staring at an old photo album Catherine had brought from Ashford Manor. He looked confused. "Is this really me?" In the photograph, a much younger Henry stood in the garden with grass stains on his trousers while two small children clung to his legs. Eleanor stood beside them laughing as the family dog leapt into the frame. "You hated taking pictures," Eleanor said softly. "You always claimed they interrupted real life. You seem to remember everything. Birthday cakes that had collapsed in the middle. 32 years preserved in fading photographs." Then Henry stopped. The picture had been taken during Eleanor's 50th birthday celebration. He was standing behind her with his arms wrapped around her shoulders, his chin resting gently against her hair. Across the bottom, written in his own handwriting, were the words, "What does that mean? You wrote it. You used to say that grand gestures were overrated. You believed love was making tea exactly the way the other person liked it. Remembering to bring home their favorite dessert. Driving through the night when they needed you. You said love wasn't about never failing. You said it was choosing to come back." Henry's breathing grew uneven. "I don't remember saying those things. You've stayed beside me every day since the accident." "Why?" Tears filled Eleanor's eyes for the first time since the accident. "Because I remember enough for both of us." Henry looked at her for a very long time. "You must have loved him very much," he said quietly. Eleanor laughed through tears. "Oh, Henry. Understand what? It was never because our marriage was perfect. I did. But every time life gave us a reason to leave, you found another reason to stay. And I suppose I'm trying to do the same." But because something deep inside him recognized the truth in her voice. "I'm sorry," he whispered. Eleanor squeezed his hand gently. "You don't have anything to apologize for. I'm sorry that I don't know how to find my way back to you. Then we'll start again." Henry never remembered Margaret Collins because, as Catherine later discovered, Margaret had moved away shortly after their youth and built a happy life of her own. But one morning, as Eleanor entered the garden carrying tea, Henry looked up from the bench where he had been sitting quietly beneath the roses. "Eleanor, I don't remember our wedding. But when you smile, it feels like coming home." Because perhaps love wasn't always found in memories. Perhaps it lived in instincts, in habits, in the inexplicable comfort of a familiar presence. Years later, people would ask Eleanor how she survived watching the man she loved forget an entire lifetime together. She always answered the same way. Love isn't just remembering someone at their best. It's choosing them on the days when life asks you to begin again. And Duke Henry Ashford never regained every memory he had lost. But each morning he chose to fall in love with Eleanor a little more than the day before. Not because he remembered the 32 years behind them, but because even without them, something in his heart still recognized hers. If Eleanor and Henry's story touched your heart, tell us in the comments. And if you've ever chosen someone again and again through life's hardest seasons, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us for more unforgettable royal stories of love, loss, devotion, and second chances.